I'm reflecting on my own history as how I became a writer. I remember I was in grade 11 when I first wrote an essay that I thought I enjoyed writing that essay, and it's a good essay. And when I look back, what had happened in the lead up to that essay is a year or two before that, I had got a subscription to Sports Illustrated.
Yep.
And I'm the kind of person who, if I'm paying for a magazine, I am reading the magazine.
Sure. Good.
And so I read Sports Illustrated cover to cover every week for 4 or 5 years.
Good ritual.
And there was some very good essays that I read in that time.
Fantastic, Brett. That's exactly right.
Picked up the rhythm of writing.
Good.
And I knew things about language and about writing that no one had ever taught me because I had read good essays.
Because you had read it, not by going to some stupid creative writing workshop, right? You did it just by reading.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I want to invite you, if you'd like to support us here at Making Every Class Catholic, the easiest way you can do that is to just subscribe to the newsletter at Making Every Class Catholic on Substack. You can sign up for the free newsletter where you get the podcast and the newsletter every month. But paying members, in addition to supporting us, will get all kinds of goodies behind the paywall, including lesson plans. I'm starting to serialize my next book back there and all kinds of other things. And in fact, you can tell us what you'd like to see back there. So if you want to support us, head on over to Substack and sign up for the newsletter. But on with the business of the day. I am delighted today to be joined by Randy Boyagoda, one of, dare I say, Canada's leading Catholic public intellectuals. I'm so excited to have you on, and a writer. So we're going to talk today about language arts and literature and Catholic education. Randy, welcome to the show.
Many thanks for having me on it, Brett.
Why don't we just start with letting you introduce yourself a little bit to our audience? Some of them, of course, will be familiar with you and your work, but to others, your name will be new. Where do you work? What do you do? What do you write about? Those kinds of things.
Well, as you said, my name is Randy Boyagoda. I am a professor of English at the University of Toronto. I am a novelist, an essayist, and a book critic. I have published 5 novels and a biography and an academic monograph. My next novel, called Lords of Serendipity, a global campus novel, comes out this September. I live in the East End of Toronto with my wife and 4 children. We attend Corpus Christi Parish. I am a cradle Catholic. My parents are Sri Lankan immigrants to Canada who arrived in the late 60s. And I grew up in Oshawa, Ontario. I eventually came to U of T for my undergraduate studies and then went to Boston University for my PhD in English, where I met my wife, Anna, also doing her PhD in English. And she also works in Catholic education as the director of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd program for the Archdiocese of Toronto. When I noted, we have 4 daughters. We live here in Toronto after a 1-year stop at the University of Notre Dame when I finished my PhD. I was the former president of PEN Canada, the Freedom of Expression organization, and also the former principal of St. Michael's College here at U of T, the Catholic College at the University of Toronto. At present, I serve as Vice Dean Undergraduate in the Faculty of Arts and Science, as the University of Toronto's advisor on civil discourse, and I continue to teach, research, and write about modern experience, often in ways that intersect with my personal, professional, and public interests in the Catholic intellectual tradition.
Wonderful. I almost want to have a whole separate conversation about your position on civil discourse, because I think that's a fascinating idea, and I'm delighted that someone like yourself is holding that position. So maybe let's put a pin in that one, because
Sure.
I think. But if it comes up organically with respect to our topic here, I'm very open to that. But I want to start with thinking a bit about literature and language arts from a Catholic point of view. You're a Catholic writer and a book critic, and one of the things I try to do with Catholic teachers is not simply give them Catholic things to read. I'm
Sure.
not against giving people Catholic things to read. It's one of the reasons you do what I do, is to get people to read books that you like. But I want us to, before we get there, think about these activities: reading, storytelling,
Mhm.
from a Catholic point of view. And so I'd love to get your thoughts about, what does it mean from a Catholic point of view that the human person is a storyteller, is a writer, it uses language,
Mhm.
those sorts of considerations.
Well, I think I would maybe begin with a friendly amendment. A Catholic point of view strikes me as a dangerously limited thing that could lead a little too easily to an ideological response. That to have a Catholic perspective is interchangeable with having any other set of political and cultural perspectives. It seems to me maybe a better way to think about this, Brett, is to think about what it means to approach the world around us, including the stories that we read, the stories that we tell, the stories that we write, informed by our faith, informed by a sense, to quote Gerard Manley Hopkins, that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. So, what does that mean in ordinary, everyday terms? Well, it means, I think, that someone drawing on their Catholic faith in relation to the world around them should be open to the possibilities of the imaginative equivalent of what happens in Mass itself when mere body, mere bread and wine is transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. In literary terms, we think about the equivalent to the high point in Mass as something along the lines of a sacramental imagination. In other words, that we can see the things around us as having the potential to be converted into something else completely, something mystical, something divine. What does it mean to approach human experience mindful that it has the potential to become something else altogether? So I think the sacramental imagination, applying the most important feature of a Catholic of the Eucharist, the concept of the Eucharist itself, the reality of the Eucharist, to things like reading and writing and telling stories. That's one thing. I think there's two other things that matter here that aren't as maybe directly theological. The second would be more anthropological, that if you are a religiously serious, religiously informed person, you understand that there is a purpose to your life. There is a greater story to your time and place on earth than, than you might discern on your own, or never mind than any version of a data report would grant you. And for religious believers, that larger sense of story for the purpose of your life and how your life connects to others has to do with the divine plan for humanity. And so, one way to try to discern the divine plan for humanity is to see evidence of it in the world around us in stories that are coherent, stories that have a beginning, middle, and end. It's hard to discern that in our own lives sometimes, but we can see it in the divine plan, and then we can find it, I think, in great stories by writers and through the act of reading. The third thing that I will say about what it means to to draw on your faith in reading and writing and telling stories would be to, I think, be grateful for the fact that as a Catholic, you are part of a global faith that is active, that is 2,000 years old, that is always already local and global in terms of your sense of belonging. So that makes available to you cultures and histories and geographies beyond your immediate experience through the shared connection, often enough, to Catholic experience itself. So you could be reading about life in Egypt in the third century, or you could be reading about life in contemporary Norway. And in both cases, you might come across an experience, either explicitly of someone who is Catholic through a story, or you can draw again on the sensibility afforded to you by being a member of a global faith in trying to make sense of human experience across these times and spaces. I think that would be my initial sense of what it means to draw on Catholicism in relation to reading, writing, language, and literature.
Right. Oh, there's so much I want to dive into. I'm going to limit myself to two quick responses and see what you think of my responses. The first, with respect to transubstantiation, my previous book before this one for teachers was on transubstantiation. And something that strikes me as really interesting is in the sacraments, we have form and matter. And the form is the words. The matter without the words is sort of indeterminate. It's not infinitely flexible. It can't mean just absolutely anything. But once the words are given to it, whether in the Eucharist or in another sacrament, it takes on a kind of definitive meaning. And it's interesting that a lot of our analogies in our minds for something like transubstantiation would be scientific because it's a sort of transformation, and we can think of chemical transformations and all that sort of thing. But that's not what the church talks about in transubstantiation at all. It's actually the physical stuff we're told doesn't change, but the deepest reality changes in response to language. Now, not just any language, God's language, right? But anyways, that struck me, right? This kind of emphasis on the formative quality, even determinative quality of language for reality and for human experience of reality. And the second thing that struck me was, okay, I'm going to misplace it. So I'm going to throw it back to you and think on my second thing. I'm just curious that sacramental imagination, we hear about it a lot, but I haven't heard it articulated, particularly with respect to language. Very often it's respect to symbol, things in our world mean more than the surface, that sort of thing. But language has such a determinative role in sacramental imagination.
I could speak to that in a couple of ways. First, obviously, we think about the sacraments always as having these two functions. They are both symbolic and efficacious. And often enough, when we think about literature, we think about it maybe too restrictively in terms of the symbolic significance of it. But I think that there's something efficacious about reading a good book. And so there is, again, an analogy perhaps that we could draw between the sacrament proper and then a sacramental approach to literature itself. The second thing that I will say with respect to language is that I think we can turn to scripture and understand the significance of language two ways. One would be the divine fiats at the beginning of the Bible in terms of Genesis and the let there be's, right, that led to the creation of the world itself. And then the second, of course, would be the famous opening to John's Gospel in the sense that the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And so the relationship between language and what it calls into being comes to us both through, as you say, the sacraments themselves, but they themselves have a deeper, I think, foundation in Scripture, in both Genesis and in the opening of John's Gospel.
Right. Oh, this is great. And I did remember now my second one, which is you used the adjective coherent to describe a story, and that it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And something that has struck me is certain kinds of like really experimental literature will try to like subvert that. And it's very disorienting. I remember the first time I read Camus in undergrad, and all of us were just like, what just happened? Like we don't, but there's this sense that like, okay, there's a series of events in time. Okay, but what do they mean? If I were to tell you what happened yesterday, I could tell it in almost an infinite number of ways, but I would be choosing some way of telling it that would make it coherent.
Yes.
And there's something deeply human about the need to make sense of things through language. And very often it's done in retrospect. Like in our life of faith, very often we can't see in the moment what, like, is this the high point of the story? Is this the crisis? Is this the denouement? Like, we don't know. But very often in retrospect, you can put the pieces together to make sense of it. Yes. So I was hoping you could say a little more about what makes a story coherent and how that relates to this stuff.
Well, I think you're right that we do have a very deep human longing for a sense of order and structure. We want things to make sense. We can point to Aristotle and his very basic sense of, a definition of a story, something that is a beginning, middle, and an end. Or we could look to someone like the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who wrote this monumental study of time and narrative in literature that drew together the work of St. Augustine and Aristotle. And at base, Ricoeur's sense, and Ricoeur, while not Catholic, was himself a practicing Christian, argued that we are, by our nature, storytelling creatures, that this is one of the fundamental marks of what it means to be human, is that we understand ourselves in narrative terms in a way that no other creature does. And because we understand ourselves in narrative terms, it's very natural to turn to literature, to turn to stories in search of a fuller, more, again, coherent account of human experience, of different lives in collision and circulation with each other. And sometimes, as you say, it doesn't always appear to be as much. And sometimes that can be frustrating, but that can also be an occasion for reflection. What is the author, let's say it's Camus in this case, trying to tell us by, at least at some level, rejecting the conventions of a coherent story? What is he telling us, perhaps, about our dependency on it? Do we try to make things a little too neat? Do we try to exclude things that don't cohere to the story we want to hear, the story we want to tell? And so at that level, it's an invitation to challenge yourself, to challenge, I think, what you normally expect from a story. Now, that said, especially if we're thinking about younger people just getting into literature itself, we don't start there. We should start with far more fundamental and stable versions of stories to get them comfortable with them. Because those, I think, speak to the desire we have for a deeper order, a sense of stability, and again, coherence in our own lives.
Right. And let me go to your third point. It was a neat sort of triptych. The sort of transcultural and transhistorical element of language. One of the things I've talked to you, even at the elementary school level, is to tell kids that like books are like time machines, or they can take you to another time and another place, right? But there's something, whether it's a explicitly Catholic experience that I can identify, or just a human experience, right? There's something about the human community that is common. You meet someone from a very different time, very different place, different religion, different whatever. If the story rings true, it's because you recognize your fellow human being, something in their experience or their ideas or whatever. And so I think that's a really essential part of it. And to tie it to the second point, if we're storytelling creatures, when God becomes man, he doesn't become an army general or a president or a great scientist or inventor or any of other things that can do, really impactful things in the world. God becomes a storyteller. And that time-bound thing, the incarnation, is mediated to the rest of us through time and space because he was such an effective storyteller. So I think maybe that ties kind of the humans as storytellers thing, and then the sort of transculture, transhistorical element of language and literature.
Well, if what you're pointing to specifically would be Christ's reliance on parables, then yes, I see what you mean. That the Bible itself obviously is a Northrop Frye would say perhaps the grand story of human experience, but certainly Jesus made the decision in terms of how he decided to teach and inspire others to do so primarily through parables alongside his miracles and his sacrificial acts.
Let's move to thinking a little more specifically about elements of the Catholic literary heritage. You created a bit of a controversy. You'll have to get the details exactly right for me, but you started an essay with something like I'm sick of Flannery O'Connor or
Yes.
something to that effect.
Mhm.
Now I should say my wife's name is Flannery, but tell folks what you meant and kind of what happened in response to this essay and what you were trying to do with that essay.
Sure. I think that would have been in 2013. It was an essay for First Things magazine that began, as you said, I'm sick of Flannery O'Connor. And then I proceeded to explain that I'm also sick of Tolkien, of C.S. Lewis, of Dostoevsky, of Chesterton. And why am I sick of all these people, Brett? I'm sick of them because they're all dead. And they're the only writers that I find contemporary Catholics bring up when you ask them, when they find out that, when people would find out I was a novelist, they would immediately ask me if I liked Flannery O'Connor, if I liked Walker Percy, all these dead people. And it struck me as a real problem because if the publishing industry realizes that Catholics are very committed readers as long as they're reading Tolkien and Chesterton, well, then make the business decision. Keep these people in print, but don't print anybody who's a contemporary writer. And so it was a lament about a tendency, perhaps, on the part of Catholics to cede the ground, to just presume that secular contemporary life and the stories it provides aren't particularly friendly or open to a religiously serious person. But in making that assumption, they're making it real, and so they're making it a reality. And so I offered that complaint that, as you say, generated a lot of response. Continues, as this very conversation demonstrates, more than a decade later, continues to generate a response. Now, I should say happily that I was wrong, and I would point to a lot of contemporary Catholic writing, not least Jan Fosse winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, a very serious, committed Catholic writer from Norway in 2023. I'd point to the Catholic imagination movement, primarily in the United States, a series of contemporary Catholic writers associated with both mainstream publishing and then also with journals like Dappled Things, Paraclete Press, and other such venues for contemporary serious Catholic writing. And then I'll just say, in personal terms, I've been very happy with the Catholic and secular response to two of my most recent novels, Original Prin and Dante's Indiana, both of which I would say would be perhaps the most religiously engaged novels I've written so far.
So our audience here is Catholic educators, and of course, the names of the people that you said you were sick of in that essay. If they're teaching any Catholic content at all, there's a good chance that those names are well represented.
Understandably.
And I don't take you to say we shouldn't read those people.
No. What I'm saying is read the living and the dead. If you just read the dead, then you're starving the living. If you just read the living, you have no sense of the deep and rich past from which you've come. And so I think we are called to read the living and the dead together.
Right. And so then my question for you is, if I'm a Catholic English teacher looking for stories that you just mentioned some presses and some periodicals and a handful of names. What kinds of considerations would you have if I'm a Catholic teacher and I want to take your advice and incorporate some living Catholic voices into my curriculum? How would I find them, and how would I make the assessments of which ones I would like to include?
Well, I would say probably in practical terms, the easiest way to find some good options for contemporary Catholic writing would be for people to do a little bit of research into what's called the Catholic Imagination Conferences, which happen at major American Catholic universities every 2 or 3 years. And if you just go take a look at those websites, you'll see a list of contemporary Catholic writers and their works. And I think you'll find a lot of good stuff that way. The American Catholic poet and essayist Dana Gioia has written a couple of very important essays on the situation of the Catholic writer today, where he lists other writers as well. That's another way, I think, to do it. But let's go a little upstream for a moment and it seems to me like the more important thing to begin with, Brett, is to get young people reading. In other words, um, before we can think about putting together, curating a really strong Catholic contemporary fiction list, as great as that would be, um, we want young people to just be reading full stop. And it seems to me like Catholic or otherwise, this is a great challenge that we all face these days, is just inculcating, curating, sustaining, encouraging young people to put down their devices and pick up books. Um, by analogy, I've uh, I've also made the observation, I think in print a couple of times, that the best way to get people to read great books is to stop reading essays about why people should read great books and just read a great book for God's sake. You know, too many times we spend too much time on Substacks and in chat rooms talking about why no one reads Dostoevsky. Well, just read Dostoevsky for God's sake. Stop talking about it. So likewise, we should just encourage a love of reading that is, and I use this term intentionally, agnostic. Just get people reading. And then when young people are there, then you can start to introduce them to books by Catholics or otherwise that are a little more intentional, perhaps, in terms of being drawn to and from questions of faith.
Right. Well, that actually leads very well into an important consideration. Very often people want recommendations for Catholic literature, but of course, in a Catholic school and just as Catholics in general, we don't just read Catholic literature; we read literature. And I think you started doing this already in the kind of questions you put with respect to Camus, right? So what is he doing? If he's not following the rules and that makes us uncomfortable, then let's think about why.
Sure.
And so that's maybe one specific example, but more generally, I'm a teacher in a Catholic school. I'm teaching literature, some of which is Catholic, hopefully, but hopefully not all of it, right? Hopefully we're just reading good literature. How and maybe you can pick a couple examples that from your own experience. How would you recommend a Catholic teacher approach a non-Catholic novel or short story in a Catholic school with the tools at their disposal that we talked about? The human as the storytelling person, the transhistorical bit, the sacramental bit. How are we going to apply those when we're reading just literature?
Sure.
Forget Catholic literature specifically.
Well, I would say maybe two things there. The one would be to think about family life. It seems to me like one of the very natural ways that a Catholic reader could engage with works, regardless of whether they're by Catholics, would be to think about family dynamics, because I think the life of family matters so centrally to the life of the church. So that's one way. The second way would be to think about vocation. We often like to read stories, watch movies. Timothy Chalamet's Marty Supreme is a good example. It just came out a little while ago. That are, in technical terms, Bildungsromans, or novels of growth, stories of growth. And one way that I think, Brett, you could approach a work, Catholic or otherwise, would be to think about it in terms of vocation. What is the vocation of this character? What is he discerning as the life he's called to lead? And how does his life story then play out? Does he accept what he's being invited to do? Does he steward the gifts he's been granted well? Like, there's those sorts of questions, which are obviously very, very much Catholic questions, apply to any great book, I think. And when it comes to the question of vocation, and then likewise the question of family life, that would be where I would go.
That actually almost has me thinking in reverse a little bit. If you're reading a novel and you're looking for these things, it strikes me that it's not hard to find them, in part because the novel is an art form that is in a way, it's based on a vision of the human person that includes those things and grew out of a cultural context in which those were kind of presuppositions in the water. And so there's a way in which, and I wonder if you might know more about this than I do, because I have this very inchoate sense of this, that the novel itself is a kind of a Christian art form and emerges in a Christian context precisely because of the kinds of things you're talking about. It has a vision of a human person on a journey with a call, and those kinds of elements. And so even once it drifts far from any explicit Christian worldview, those pieces are part of what makes a novel almost.
To be honest, I've never heard that reading of a novel. I mean, speaking now more perhaps as an English professor, I would probably more naturally point to the rise of the novel in the 18th century in places like England and in continental Europe as coinciding with an increased attention to the individual and to individual experience, which comes often out of the Enlightenment. There are a lot of ways that the novel is understood to be, in many ways, a response to scripture, meaning a counter set of stories. In other words, instead of only listening to divine stories, why don't we listen to some human stories? And then that sense of individual experience also, I think, tracks onto the sense, and this is from the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, that the rise of the novel, no, sorry, this is the French guy, Bourdieu, my apologies, I think it's Bourdieu, coincided with the rise of individual experience. In other words, the novel is an individual experience. It's shared, obviously, when we're teaching, when we're learning, when we're talking about books, but it's an individual experience in a way that oral culture, sitting around listening to someone tell a story, is a communal experience of narrative. Now, to the degree that novels are concerned with human experience and with trying to plot out human lives in relation to each other as part of some larger plan, absolutely. You can see how a Christian understanding of the world would make sense with it. But generally speaking, the rise of the novel is understood, I think, to be more of a secular phenomenon than a sacred one.
Okay. That's interesting. I want to explain. I think it's Walker Percy somewhere in one of his letters talks about the novel as a Christian art form. But what you just said is an interesting.
Anything could be in a sense, right?
Right.
But I think just again in just to be the English professor for a moment, that's not generally the received understanding of where novels came from.
Right. And yeah, well, I want to go digging more and learn more what he meant by it. I mean, it's an interesting thing that a counterbalance to certain kinds of stories still grows out, right? Something of the genesis remains even in the counter.
Sure. Tolstoy, someone like Tolstoy was very intentional in making that connection. And if you think about the way that he writes about the capital A author at various points in War and Peace, he's understanding himself as almost, he's writing in at some level competition, but also in recognition that the ultimate version of the book of life is the Bible itself. The same way that the ultimate version of life itself is God's creating. The author of all life creates the world, creates the universe in a sense. So you can see parallels there, and that would make sense to me. I think maybe a little more than at least how you're describing Walker Percy's version of things.
Okay. Very good. Okay, I need to learn more about this. When one of the things that people will request of me and of you more than of me, I'm sure, is like, tell me which books to read. And of course, I don't want to do that too much.
Sure.
Though sometimes I give in and I say, I would love it if every high school senior who graduated from a Catholic school had read a canticle for Leibowitz, for example. And so maybe before I ask you if there's a novel or a short story you would like to recommend, maybe tell us why that's not your favorite question.
Well, because I think at some level it becomes a little too prescriptive. Obviously, I'm a great evangelist for books. I review books all the time. I write books. I'm always happy to give people recommendations. But if the frame is too prescriptively Catholic, well, then there's going to be sex and swearing in this book. There's going to be violence in this book. I'm not sure how that's going to land for you, But let me think. If I had to think about a couple of titles that, let's say, I wish I had read. So we'll go with The Dead to begin with.
That's a good way to put it.
I had read by the time I graduated from high school. I wish by the time I graduated from high school, I'd read St. Augustine's Confessions. And I could have. It would have made sense to me in terms of its levels of difficulty relative to the levels of difficulty we expect of students in math and science. I wish by the end of high school, I had read a little bit of Dante at the very least. Again, if I can read Shakespeare, I should be able to read Dante. And I think those would have been writers whose works I would have benefited from being exposed to earlier. And I think you would kind of come back to them in a lot of ways. I think that people should, at some point, maybe a little later in life, and here I wouldn't say everyone, but rather readers who are interested, um, they should read something like Middlemarch by George Eliot, a wonderful 19th century novel that just gives you a multi generational cast in a small place as everyone faces the same question: what am I called to do with my life in this place with the people around me? And they have good and bad answers to those questions, with and for and against each other. And if you read that book over and over again across your life, you'll see it from a different perspective every time, because you'll see it through a different character, because again, it's multi generational. To turn for a moment to the question of living writers, uh, one very, I think, straightforward example that I would recommend would be Tobias Wolff, who is a Catholic writer from California, best known for his wonderful short stories. And I would recommend a story called In the Garden of the North American Martyrs. That strikes me as a very good story for that's accessible, that raises lots of faith related questions without again being pietistic. I would say that is also, I would say, makes sense in terms of content also for teenagers. So that would be, I think, one example. I think the writer George Saunders, raised Catholic, now a Tibetan Buddhist, writes uh, stories about human experience that I think very much come out of his own sense of the deeper coherence of the world. If it's a coherence not afforded by our sense, but by an eternal divine sense. And he has collections like the 10th of December, for instance, that are full of, again, accessible and strange and weird stories. Again, I would encourage teachers to take a look first. And I mentioned these in part. So far, I'm very mindful that, with the exception of Eliot, everyone has been a male writer that I've recommended. If we have a general crisis of reading, I think we have an especial crisis of young men reading. Generally speaking, especially when it comes to fiction, readerships tend to skew heavily towards women these days. And I think encouraging more young men to get away from their screens and all the garbage they find on them to turn to literature is a good idea. Something like Big Two Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway, a deceptively simple story about a young man who goes on a fishing trip that actually proves to be a story that's deeply about ritual experience. That strikes me as something that's worth reading. Cormac McCarthy's The Road, a dystopic novel about a young man, about a boy and his father, at the far end of an apocalypse, trying to make sense of themselves and their lives, and how to survive and how to lead a good life in a rough and terrible world. Again, a story that invites conversation from someone, again, who was himself raised Catholic and has some version had some version of a sacramental imagination. So those would be some examples. I think if we went in a different direction, I would point to someone like Elena Ferrante and her excellent novel, My Brilliant Friend, about two girls growing up impoverished in 1950s Naples. And it's the intense and vivid story of their friendship and the world around them. And it being Italy in mid-century, Catholicism figures in a deeply cultural way. That's, I think, worth taking a look at. Marilyn Robinson, not Catholic, but a very religiously serious Calvinist writer, writes beautiful novels. She has a trio focused on an old preacher in 1950s Kansas and his family. It begins with a novel called Gilead. And then it goes from there, I think, to Jack, and I forget the third, but easy enough to find. But anyway, these are all, I think, contemporary writers worth taking a look at. Kirsten Valdez Quaid is a contemporary writer who again writes very, very thoughtfully and seriously about faith. Katie Carl's another, Christopher Beha, Phil Clay. These are all contemporary writers. Joshua Haren, whose work I think would be worth taking a look at. And again, that just goes back to my earlier point. Take a look at that Catholic Imagination website, and you'll see a lot of different writers there, I think. And then finding from there what would make sense for a given class. I don't know, obviously the same way that teachers would, what would make sense for their classes. That would be a way to go. I would say, turning autobiographical for a moment, I wrote a short story called Sister St. Maisie, Connecticut for a journal called Image a few years ago. And it's a contemporary version of a saint's life. Very accessible, sort of story that I think a high school audience could read. I wrote a novella, I published a novella last year called Little Sanctuary, not Catholic, but very much informed, I think, by my sense of family life. And it's a dystopic novel about a group of children at the end of the world trying to survive in an unexpected way when their parents send them to a far off island where they're meant to be taken care of, and then they realize that the people taking care of them intend to do them harm. So it's kind of a children's adventure story. And then I guess I would just end by saying that the novel that often Catholics ask me about the most is original print. Now, this is read more, I think, at the university level and by adults than by high school students, but for teachers themselves, it might be of interest. And it's about a bike riding Sri Lankan Catholic English professor and his family living in downtown Toronto, where he teaches at a failing Catholic college. At the beginning of the novel, the college is going to close unless the protagonist goes to the Middle East with his sexy ex-girlfriend from graduate school to open up a satellite campus. The novel begins 8 months before he became a suicide bomber. Prin went to the zoo with his family. And I think that's a novel that certainly other people have talked about a great deal as a work of serious comic Catholic fiction in the contemporary period.
Well, I can confirm for the audience that it is a very funny book. I really enjoyed Original Prin, and it does one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which is it gives the audience the possibility of imagining that Catholics are still alive and working in the world today, which was, almost startling to encounter that in literature because we just don't see that very often. And I will say I was working with a group of Catholic English teachers in Alberta in December or November, and I read to them the opening. I don't know if it's the first paragraph. I think it's the first several paragraphs before the first break of Sister St. Maisie, Connecticut.
Oh, okay, great.
And it ends with this sort of like knock you over with a feather kind of line where the father is able to make his daughter cry because he always I won't spoil it for anyone, but the father, he has children. He's not able to make her cry. He's all the other kids, he's able to make them cry. And this little girl, he can't make her cry.
Yes.
And
it's a
then
terrifying moment.
And it's a terrifying moment for him and for his wife. And so I read that to the teachers, and we were all just sort of like, okay, what's going on? What happens next?
And I wrote it very intentionally as a version of a saint's life. And so readers can figure out what happens next. But it is the kind of story, I think, that is available for high school reading. And the other thing I should say is the novella I mentioned a moment ago, Little Sanctuary, it began as a short story that appeared in The Walrus, again, available online easily enough. And I know that this has already been read in some high schools and discussed as a short story, a very contemporary feeling short story. So that's another way perhaps that people might be able to engage with a contemporary Catholic writer, but at the same time engaging the students in questions, themes, situations that speak to the world at large, well beyond the question of faith, but one for which the question of faith is hopefully a leaven and an informing presence.
Right. Now, most of what we've discussed here is probably high school kind of level. But you mentioned earlier you have 4 daughters. I'm sure you've read a few children's books in your day. What would you say to elementary and middle school teachers, even if it's just a handful of like the favorite books you read to your own kids, Catholic or not? I'm not picky about that. Just some great books for younger kids.
Well, there's going to be no real surprises here, I think. Watership Down was a novel that I remember reading with great pleasure and uh, and to productive effect with our four daughters when they were little. That's, I think, Richard Adams, I think, is the author's name, and it's an extended fable about rabbits in a version of the English countryside and all their internal political conflict, and then also the always greater pressure of the evil farmer, I guess you could say. But that was very well received. Maurice Sendak is always a writer, I think, whose imagination really grabs children. I think the other thing that we've done that's gone over well with our kids would be good, thoughtful, and creative child-friendly adaptations of classics. And so I'm thinking about is it Lamb's Shakespeare, for example,
Lamb's
or
Tales from
yeah,
Shakespeare.
Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, or what was it? We've had a couple of graphic novel versions of the Odyssey, and I think also Odysseus that have of the Iliad that have gone over very well. At some point, I wish I'd done this already. I wish I had read to my children Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a wonderful, wonderful poem, a deeply, deeply liturgical poem. If you take a look at it, about a strange quest that starts just after Christmas in the court of King Arthur. Those have all been well received. My kids love the Tintin books. What's his name? Hervé, the author, the French detective, French kind of kid detective comics. They devoured those when they were little. And right now our youngest is very much enjoying the Earthsea Chronicles by Ursula K. Le Guin fantasy series. So they've been all over the place. Obviously, they read Harry Potter way too much at various points, and we've been glad to get them beyond that. So those would be just some of the things. But again, as long as you're reading to your kids and you're reading to them something that opens up their imaginations, then that's already a big win as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Let me throw two that just came into my mind as you were speaking, and maybe you've heard of them. Speaking of retellings of classics, have you ever encountered the work of, and I hope I say her name right because the spelling is really difficult, Geraldine McCaughrean?
No, don't know the name.
So we've read her version of El Cid and of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. No, not all of them, but selections from Canterbury Tales. They are an absolute delight.
Oh, okay, good to know.
So I would recommend to people Geraldine McCaughrean's retellings of some great classic stories. And then contemporary, my kids have loved The Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart.
Yeah, my kids have enjoyed that as well.
So those are two I would recommend. Yeah, let me finish with a thought that follows from the living Catholic tradition, right? There are Catholic writers writing today, and we should read them. We should also be trying to cultivate them in our classrooms. If they're going to read living Catholic authors, and they might be one. Not all of them, of course, are going to be called to be writers, but the Catholic literature doesn't appear ex nihilo. It appears in a context with people in families and schools and cultures and parishes that shape them. And so I wonder if I'm a Catholic English teacher who would like to have to think of maybe my classroom as a nursery for potential writers.
Sure.
What would be some considerations that you would share for that kind of goal?
Well, it's really simple. Forget it. Make them readers. Make them readers. The writers will become writers on their own, but only if they're readers first. My worry, and this has nothing to do with the Catholic context, is that everybody wants to be a writer. Nobody wants to be a reader. The number of times as a university professor, undergraduates will come see me and tell me that they want to become writers, and I'll ask them who they read it, and they'll, that's a really good question. Everybody likes the idea of becoming a writer. They see it as romantic. They see it as exciting. But you don't become a writer unless you were a reader first, last, and always. And so the best version of the nursery you're describing is one that is full of reading good things, reading the living and the dead. And then someone who may have a vocation to writing will discover it through their reading lives. But if we short circuit it and just turn it into everybody start writing, they're going to just end up writing about themselves. They're going to write about very thin things because they don't have a furnished enough life or imagination to do more than that. And then it just becomes thin thereafter. But if they're reading a lot, if that becomes the norm for them, I often point out to people who aren't writers that when writers get together, we don't talk about what we write, we talk about what we read. Again, reading is the best thing. It's the best thing for public life. It's the best thing for civil discourse because of the ways in which it encourages and cultivates an imagination willing to see perspectives beyond your own, willing to understand someone you don't you disagree with, you otherwise perceive in political terms as on the other side. But then you get a deeper sense of humanity, and we turn to writing. We turn to writers to make that possible for us, but they can only make that possible if they're reading. So if there's Catholic teachers who want to advance the cause of contemporary and future Catholic writing, the best way to do it is to just get as many people reading as many books as possible.
Okay, this is fascinating. I'm reflecting on my own history as how I became a writer. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not a writer in the way you are, but I write.
Yeah, you write, sure.
I remember I was in grade 11 when I first wrote an essay that I thought I enjoyed writing that essay, and it's a good essay. And when I look back, what had happened in the lead up to that essay is a year or two before that, I had got a subscription to Sports Illustrated.
Yep.
And I'm the kind of person who, if I'm paying for a magazine, I am reading the magazine.
Sure. Good.
And so I read Sports Illustrated cover to cover every week for 4 or 5 years.
Good ritual.
And Sports Illustrated has good writing. There are
not so much anymore, but it did.
Fair enough. This was in the mid 1990s.
Sure.
And there was some very good essays that I read in that time.
Fantastic, Brett. That's exactly right.
Picked up the rhythm of writing, good. And I knew things about language and about writing that no one had ever taught me because I had read good essays.
Because you had read it, not by going to some stupid creative writing workshop, right? You did it just by reading. Right.
Yeah. So just to say that your point resonates with my own experience, and maybe let's finish with this. Why would you be willing to share with us how you found your vocation as a writer?
Sure. I would say that my earliest memories of storytelling have to do with reading, so consistent, I think, with that sense. And at least this is my version of it. Growing up in an immigrant family, growing up in Oshawa in the 1980s, no one was encouraging me to become a writer because that sounds weird. None of my friends, my family, my teachers, it sounds weird. And it's not respectable. It's not practical, certainly to an immigrant family. And they're right. And I'm glad that I wasn't encouraged and cosseted. I'm glad that I had to kind of do it on my own, on the side, in quiet ways. And, it continues to this day. I have a day job, obviously, as you can tell from my office. I'm a professor and a university administrator, but I write whenever I get a chance to. And I think this is really important. Yes, I write novels that they get published and get written about in lots of good places, and I get to go all over the place and talk about my books. But in an alternative version of me, I am a high school English teacher, probably at Paul Dwyer Catholic High School in Oshawa, and I am still writing. You know what I mean? In other words, it's not to get published and get reviewed and get to go on interesting podcasts like yours. I have a vocation to write that is always with me. It's been there since, probably grade 4 or 5. I was probably writing in secret various stories, and I kept on going from there. And I really do mean it when I say that no one encouraged me, and thank God no one encouraged me, because that developed a desire in me to do this in response to resistance, in response to perceptions that there's nothing good about doing this. But if I had been encouraged and, praised the entire way, I don't think we'd be talking right now.
That's fascinating. I have a daughter who reads and reads and reads and reads and reads and has started writing some things that are pretty impressive for her age. And I'm not gonna discourage her, obviously, but I'm gonna take what you just said
let her
to
be.
heart.
Let her figure it out.
Right.
You know, don't try to gussy it all up when she can probably just figure it out on her own. If she's hungry enough for it, she's going to do it.
Right. Well, and as you were talking, I recognized in myself when I haven't written anything in a while, I get restless.
Yeah.
And if I get some writing done at work on a given day, because I had the discipline to set aside the time, and I go home and I say to my wife, I wrote like a page and a half today. I just feel like a human being.
Yeah, well, there you go. That suggests it's part of your vocation to be a writer.
Right. Beautiful. Randy Boyagoda, thank you so much for joining us today on the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. Where can people find, you've mentioned a handful of places, but if they just want to go to all things Randy Boyagoda, where should they start?
Well, I think probably if you just want to learn more about me, the University of Toronto would have a couple of websites associated with my work as a professor and as a civil discourse advisor, easy enough to find online. And then, of course, the usual places, whether Amazon or Indigo, would be places to go to find more about my novels. And then the last thing I'll just say is that I have a new novel coming out in September called Lords of Serendipity. It'll be published all around the world, including here in Canada. And it's about a Sri Lankan village girl who dreams of going to Harvard and then does whatever it takes to make that dream come true.
Okay. Well, I look forward to it. I've read Original Prin, and I'm waiting on Dante's Indiana. That's on my list. And so I'll have to watch for the novella as well. And I recommend these to our listeners. Listeners, thank you again for joining us. If you'd like to support us, as I mentioned, head over to Substack and sign up for the Making Every Class Catholic newsletter. And don't be shy to share this with a friend or colleague that you think would benefit. Thanks again, Randy, and thank you everyone for listening.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
God bless.